Estos problemas de sobreexplotación en la naturaleza no son nuevos. Muchos expertos han analizado nuestros recursos de manera global y han predicho que habrá problemas. Una persona, Garrett Hardin, escribió una parábola acerca de esto en 1968. Él habló de una área común de tierra que nadie poseía, pero que todos en Parish usaban. En su historia había 10 aldeanos, cada uno tenía una vaca en la comuna. Esto era igual a la capacidad natural de la tierra. Un día, una aldeana decidió aumentar el número de vacas que tenía, de 1 a 2. Matemáticamente, se podría expresar su ganancia de tierra como 1/10. Con su vaca extra, su parte aumentó a 2/11. Como 2/11 es mayor a 1/10, ella ganaría. Pero los otros habían tenido una pérdida, de 1/10 a 1/11. Un vecino vio que fue una buena idea y decidió imitarla. La ganancia de ella fue de 1/11 a 2/12. Los otros aldeanos perdieron al bajar a 1/12. ¿Puede ver un patrón? Pronto, los otros empezaron a notar sus pérdidas. Ellos también tuvieron que incrementar el número de vacas, pero la tierra no podía continuar con esta carga. El pasto no crecía y todas las vacas murieron. Por tomar decisiones a corto plazo para maximizar sus ganancias, los aldeanos ignoraron los efectos a largo plazo.
To explain carrying capacity, you created an analogy of the tragedy of the commons.
Yes.
Could you explain that for us?
The tragedy of the commons is concerned with the problem of allocation of resources. For religious reasons, many people want to adopt a motto like the one that Karl Marx expressed, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. In other words, the mere fact that you exist entitles you to your share of whatever there is that's around. Now, no other species of animal operates by this principle, and to think that human beings can do so safely is a very radical idea, and biologists don't think that they can. And as a matter of fact, the experiments that have been tried among human beings have shown that it doesn't work. For example, when you have a common pasture land and anybody who wants to can pasture his cattle on it, this works as long as there aren't many people. But as soon as there are many people, meaning many animals to be pastured, it turns out that people will put too many animals on the pasture, and if they're completely free to do what they want to, and finally you have to do either one of two things. Either you divide the pasture up into many different pieces of private property, and each person is responsible for his own, or you say, we'll manage this as a group, we'll appoint a manager, we'll pay him to manage this, and he will tell us how many cattle we can put on the land, and we have to do as he says. So it's either socialism or private property. Either one of those may work, but the unmanaged commons cannot possibly work once the population gets above a certain size.
What happens when we run out of resources? The earth, if you compare it to a lifeboat, only has so many resources, can only take care of so many people.
Well, we don't exactly run out of them. The allocation per person per year becomes less, and we just have to tighten our belts and live on less. And as long as we can live, I suppose we will tighten our belts and complain about it, but we can't expect to be infinitely rich and infinitely numerous at the same time.
How many people can this planet take care of at the standard of living that Americans enjoy today?
The standard of living that Americans enjoy today cannot possibly hold for the entire present population of the earth. That is, 5 billion people living on the American standard of living would produce so much pollution. The greenhouse effect would escalate so rapidly, and many other things would change for the worse so fast we couldn't possibly do it. So the world cannot possibly live at the American standard of living at its present population size. That means either the number of people have to be reduced and or the American standard of living has to go down.
My guest is Dr. Garrett Hardin, Professor Emeritus of Human Ecology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He's the author of numerous scientific and popular works. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much.
Why do you consider the world and even the United States overpopulated?
Because if in imagination you think of the population suddenly decreasing by, say, 10% painlessly, I think you'll find many things will immediately be much better. Less traffic congestion, less stress in general, more food per person, and so on.
Perhaps less pollution, fewer
Indeed.
crimes?
Indeed, yes.
So you're saying that the major social crises that we have are really due to too many people?
Well, I would say that they're made worse by the number of people. They're due to many things, but they're made worse by excess population.
How do we solve that?
Well, we have to first of all convince people that they don't have to have a large number of children to be happy. This is an educational process. And maybe we can also perhaps jimmy the tax structure so as to favor people who have fewer children. This is a possibility.
Government policy generally ignores population as a problem.
Or, worse yet, many governments actually try to encourage the production of more people. This is partly a leftover from earlier days when cannon fodder meant strength. The more young people you had, the more larger the army that you had, and the better off you were. This is no longer true.
You're advocating a total value change then?
That's right, yes. And I think it's just one of many real value changes that have to take place in modern times.
More people does not necessarily mean a bigger, stronger nation, a bigger, stronger populace.
That's right. Think, for example, of a country like China. If their population suddenly doubled, there would be no sense in which they'd be a threat to the rest of the world. Whereas if their population suddenly were cut in half, then they might be, because there would be more resources per person.
We have to discuss this resource people issue because a lot of people say there are plenty of resources. There is plenty of food for everyone.
Oh, there's plenty of food. That's not the problem. But think instead in terms, for instance, the United States. Just think of all the problems that come from having people too crowded. Think of the amount of time that people spend commuting. If you have more people, you're not going to be able to remedy that. You build more highways, but things don't get better, they get worse.
When you say there is plenty of food, you're assuming that the population is stable.
Well, in a sense, but there's more than enough food, and you can argue that it's a matter of distribution. That isn't where the problem is now. It's in congestion and in pollution. And the more people you have, the more pollution you have. See, that won't get better. But we can make more food, but we cannot make more space to absorb the pollutants.
Aren't we using 40% of all our land for human consumption now?
Oh, I don't know what the percentage is. You see, the percent of our land that is farmland is only about 7 to 9%. Most of our land, and it's true for most countries, is not farmland and shouldn't be.
Aren't we using 40% of all our land for human consumption now?
Well, think of the states like Utah, Arizona, Montana, and so on. How much of that land is farmable? Very little of it. That's all right. But we still have enough to produce all the food we need and enough to export a great deal of food. Food is not the problem, but the pollution, area for absorbing pollution is severely limited, and we're having more and more trouble getting rid of our pollutants.
Isn't it also the use of non-renewable resources?
Yes, though what that comes down to eventually is energy. For example, the minerals are non-renewable in a sense, but in another sense you can get them back. You can harvest your dumps and get copper and iron back, but it'll cost you a lot of energy. So we're not going to run out of copper or iron, but it'll take more and more energy to get it back into shape, to recycle it.
Depends on what kind of energy we use.
Energy is going to be limiting in any case.
Coal and oil are being exploited at such a rate that in about 200 years there might not be any left.
That's right. And so we'll have to come down to using solar energy, which can work very well. Again, it's limited. After all, the sun only shines so brightly every day. It can't shine brighter. But we have a lot there, but it'll take a tremendous capital investment to gather that solar energy so that we can use it.
People often say that there's plenty of land out there for more people, but are we able to sustain more people? Water, especially.
Yes, that's certainly true. Yes, and the water, again, that comes back to energy. We've got plenty of water in the ocean. We can desalinate the ocean, but it takes a tremendous amount of energy to desalinate. So again, we come back to energy as the prime limiting factor.
If we switch totally to solar energy, would we be able to have an increased population?
Well, you can figure that out, which I can't do offhand. Sure, it could be more than we have now, but remember, if you change entirely to solar energy, it means a fair share of your land area will be covered up by solar collectors, which means you can't use it for some other purpose. I mean, the deserts, for example, would be fine places to put solar collectors. That means you can't have them for recreation areas.
And they're beautiful left natural right now.
That's right. They won't be beautiful by the time they get covered with solar collectors.
So we're trading off aesthetics for a standard of living.
That's right. But aesthetics are part of the standards of living. So this is the sort of thing we have to face, is realize we can't have everything we want, can't have all the goodies simultaneously. We trade one for another. We can't have them all together.
What would be your vision of a world that is ecological?
Well, see, there you get into a matter of personal taste and personal prejudices. It happens that I like sort of essentially outdoors and rural sort of environments. I wouldn't be happy living on Manhattan. I've been there frequently and so on, but I don't want to live there. I don't think anybody should live there. But there are many people who are petrified when they get out in a wilderness area. They think, oh, what a terrible place to be. So there are differences of opinion, but I suppose what one has to say in general is we ought to have the option of wilderness areas and wild areas for those people who want it. And the more population we have, the greater the population, the smaller percentage can even have that option.
What is the actual carrying capacity of the land?
The carrying capacity has to be determined by your standard of living. This is why I often speak of the cultural carrying capacity. And I can put this at least easiest to see in terms of energy. It takes about 2,300 calories per person per day just to live. Nothing more than live and do a mild amount of work, but not have anything else to speak of. Americans, as a matter of fact, use 100 times that much. 100 times 2,300, 230,000 kilocalories per person per day. These extra calories are used for heat, light, electricity, clothing, automobiles, cameras, movies, radio, television, all these things, roads, building roads, repairing them and so on. All these other uses. Well, if we give up many of those uses, then the carrying capacity increases. In other words, the more cultural riches we have, the lower the carrying capacity. So this is a trade-off thing. There's no way of answering what the carrying capacity of the United States is unless you specify what quality of life you have in mind. The higher the quality, materialistically speaking, the higher the quality, the lower the carrying capacity.
Nobody wants to go back in time. Most people enjoy the current standard of living that they are enjoying. So let's take today's standard.
Well, on today's standard, obviously Americans are living on it. I mean, the average American has an average American style of life. But not all Americans live that well, and some of the ones who are living below that standard would like to climb up to it. Well, if they do, and there isn't simply a change of places, then somebody's going to have to move over, or we're going to have to find more energy someplace.
Y va a ser transmitida por la página web de esta asociación. Quiero discutir con ustedes hoy el problema del clima, del cambio climático global como un bien común. Es nuestro commons, nuestro recurso común global mayor del mundo entero. Se ha estado preguntando, usted ha estudiado muchos recursos comunes de pequeña escala alrededor del mundo. ¿Esto tiene algún impacto para entender el cambio climático? Y mi respuesta es sí, pero no directamente. No se puede trasladar directamente lo que hacen la gente en una comunidad en Oaxaca y escalarlo. Lo que he aprendido es que hay una gran diversidad de formas de responder a este tipo de problemas y debemos reconocer esta diversidad. El cambio climático es básicamente un mal climático global, es un mal global. Nadie puede ser excluido de los impactos del incremento de los gases de invernadero y francamente nadie hace mucho más que los otros hacen, entonces es un mal público, es un common. Los individuos más bien no hay incentivos para tomar acciones para cambiar si no se percibe lo importante que es, pero la bibliografía actual subraya que nadie va a hacer nada mientras otros no lo hagan. La recomendación en la literatura más frecuente es que es un problema global, entonces necesitamos soluciones globales. Quiero analizar con ustedes que no debemos esperar a que existan soluciones globales. Hay muchos debates que tienen lugar hoy y pronto habrá uno muy importante en Río de Janeiro, en Río +20. Hay propuestas de bonos de carbono que significan que hay un límite de las emisiones por país y entonces en cada país las gentes van a negociar los derechos a emitir gases. Otras propuestas son impuestos para las emisiones de gases. Y parte del debate, y yo me incluyo en esta posición, es que son problemas de gran escala por muy largo tiempo. Tenemos tratados internacionales que premian a aquellos que han creado el problema. Entonces esto es un debate muy importante. Son cuestiones muy difíciles e importantes, debates muy difíciles e importantes. Hay propuestas responsables en las distintas partes. Y las distintas propuestas tienen sustento sólido, pero yendo a analizar los detalles que tendrían la aplicación de cada una es un gran reto y no podemos esperar. Tenemos que seguir avanzando. Mientras esperamos por la solución de estos debates, no vamos a hacer nada hasta que los grandes tomadores de decisiones toman decisiones. Entonces estoy sumamente preocupada. No solo es calentamiento, es variabilidad climática, extremos meteorológicos extremos, el nivel del mar sube, se pierden zonas costeras e islas, problemas en las costas. Si viviera, la recomendación en la literatura más frecuente es que es un problema global, entonces necesitamos soluciones globales. Quiero analizar con ustedes que no debemos esperar a que existan soluciones globales. Hay muchos debates que tienen lugar hoy y pronto habrá uno muy importante en Río de Janeiro, en Río +20. Hay propuestas de bonos de carbono que significan que hay un límite de las emisiones por país y entonces en cada país las gentes van a negociar los derechos a emitir gases. Otras propuestas son impuestos para las emisiones de gases. Y parte del debate, y yo me incluyo en esta posición, Es que son problemas de gran escala por muy largo tiempo. Tenemos tratados internacionales que premian a aquellos que han creado el problema. Entonces esto es un debate muy importante. Son cuestiones muy difíciles e importantes, debates muy difíciles e importantes. Hay propuestas responsables en las distintas partes. Y las distintas propuestas tienen sustento sólido, pero yendo a analizar los detalles que tendrían la aplicación de cada una es un gran reto y no podemos esperar. Tenemos que seguir avanzando. Mientras esperamos y por la solución de estos debates, no vamos a hacer nada hasta que los grandes tomadores de decisiones toman decisiones. Entonces estoy sumamente preocupada. No solo es calentamiento, es variabilidad climática, extremos meteorológicos extremos, el nivel del mar sube, se pierden zonas costeras e islas, problemas en las costas. Tengo muy buenos amigos viviendo en Bangladesh y Holanda y esto implica un gran problema. Voy a proponer una variedad de preguntas. La primera es la teoría convencional de la acción colectiva iniciada por Olson y Harding. ¿Es la mejor teoría para pensar cómo reducir emisiones? Aplicada por muchos académicos, muchas gentes no reducirán las emisiones sino hasta que los gobiernos los forcen a hacerlos. Estoy siguiendo a Harding. Entonces se ve a los acuerdos globales como la única estrategia. Otra serie de preguntas tiene que ver con el cambio de actitudes generará bienes globales o bienes locales. Hay muchos bienes globales que son generados por esfuerzos locales para reducir las emisiones de gases de invernadero. Entonces, distintas escalas de emisiones es una perspectiva muy importante para pensar este problema y las acciones que deben llevarse a cabo hasta que se sumen y alcancen una escala global no solucionarán estos problemas. Pero necesitamos comenzar a trabajar. Otra pregunta es, ¿estamos seguros que los gobiernos centrales son siempre capaces de resolver los problemas de acción colectiva, las fallas de acción colectiva? Otra pregunta tiene que ver con los problemas de distintas unidades de toma de decisión. ¿Se sobreponen? ¿Son redundantes? ¿Hay problema de tener demasiados centros de toma de decisión? ¿Y tendremos problema de dispersión? Hay problemas potenciales de tener demasiados actores influyendo. La última pregunta se refiere a cómo una perspectiva policéntrica implica de mejora de política respecto a basarse, a depender de una sola estrategia centralizada para resolver este tipo de problemas. Me refiero a policentricidad como una forma de gobernanza y articulación de distintas unidades, desde el nivel de los hogares hasta los gobiernos regionales, nacionales y globales. Es una forma de pensar estas preguntas. Déjenme darles una rápida perspectiva de la teoría de la acción colectiva tradicional. El supuesto es que muchos individuos relacionados con las emisiones de gases de invernadero, colectivamente, las acciones de todos ellos han llevado a este problema global. Entonces, hacer que la gente reduzcan sus emisiones es potencialmente muy costoso y tenemos problemas de abusadores, de gorrones, de free riders. Entonces, las personas que no están preocupadas por esto y no toman ninguna acción, por más simple que sea, están abusando de los esfuerzos de otros, sin cooperar. Hay otros de nosotros que somos perdedores potencialmente, aunque no queramos serlo. No queremos quedarnos sin hacer nada, no queremos quedarnos sin tomar acción.